Henry Klibenov and Brenda Stevenson to be members of the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Review Board. I want to welcome each of you to this hearing today and certainly congratulate you on what is truly an historic nomination. I'm grateful for your willingness to serve. You are the first nominees chosen to serve in these very vital roles. And if confirmed, you will have a solemn responsibility to begin this board's very important work. The board, which was created in 2019 by a bipartisan law inspired by the work of high school students in New Jersey, reviews records from civil rights cases for public release, including race-related murders and lynchings that have tragically gone unresolved for decades. This has delayed closure for communities and families who have wrestled with the pain of tragically unsolved civil rights crimes. They've had to wait for far too long for justice to be served and for the perpetrators of these crimes to be held accountable for their horrific actions. I'm pleased that this summer, President Biden nominated 4 very distinguished and highly qualified nominees to serve on the board. Your expertise in history, in law and journalism will help uncover the truth and get much needed answers that will help many families and communities heal from these tragic unsolved murders. Once confirmed, today's nominees will begin the difficult but important work of telling the victims' stories and shedding light on this dark chapter of our nation's history. Although justice has been delayed for too long for too many of these cases, the board's mission to investigate and release relevant records will help Americans living today and for generations to come uncover the truth of these terrible crimes and the racism that drove their perpetrators. So thank you again to our nominees for your willingness to take on these critical new roles. I look forward to hearing more about your qualifications and your visions for the role of this important and historic board. Next, I want to introduce, and I'm honored to say that we are joined virtually by a former colleague of mine and a former member of this committee as well, Senator Doug Jones, who is going to introduce the nominees. As many of you know, Senator Jones has dedicated much of his life's work to righting these long-standing wrongs. His work to prosecute the men responsible for the 1963 16th Street Baptist Church bombing that took the lives of 4 young girls finally helped to deliver justice after nearly 40 years. Senator Jones was also absolutely instrumental in the creation of this board, leading this legislation in the United States Senate. It's an honor to have him here, join us here today. Senator Jones, always a pleasure to see you. We miss you here on the committee and all the outstanding work that you did while you were here, but I'm glad you're back to introduce these amazing nominees. You may proceed with your introductions.
Well, thank you, Chairman Peters. It's great to see you and the other members of the committee. I know Ranking Member Portman is going to be joining a little bit late, but I want to thank everybody for allowing me to come today to introduce these incredible nominees to the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Collection Act Review Board. This was a signature piece of legislation for me in 2018, my first year in the Senate. And you alluded to this, Chairman Peters, but what many folks really don't know is some of the backstory. So if you'll bear with me just a moment, I think it's really important to talk about that just a moment, because a year or so before my Senate campaign was even on the radar, I get a call from Stu Wexler, a high school teacher in Hightstown, New Jersey. He and his students had been trying to study some of these old civil rights cold cases, and they had been stymied. They understood and saw the importance of making this information public for communities, for families, but they had been stymied because so many of the records were either under seal or just protected in some way or another. So it was the students who had the idea of creating a Kennedy assassination-like committee or review board to study and to look through these records to see and determine to make these public. They really understood the importance of this. And After I was elected, I of course endorsed the concept of the bill. After I was elected, they called me back and reminded me of that phone call. And of course, we got to work. And I am so appreciative of, along with colleague Senator Cruz, Senator McCaskill, who was the ranking member on this committee at the time, and then Senator Kamala Harris, to introduce the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Collection Act of 2018. I really am grateful to Senator Cruz for partnering with me on this legislation to make it happen, and our staffs who worked so hard. I'm appreciative to Senator Johnson, who was the chair of the committee, and his staff for the work that they did in a bipartisan way to get the bill passed through committee and in the Senate. I also think it's important to thank Congressman Bobby Rush over in the House of Representatives for his great work, and to thank President Trump for signing this bill, and of course to President Biden for nominating these outstanding individuals. Mr. Chairman, the experience of prosecuting the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing case was truly transformational for me. Almost 40 years after the fact, to really finally bring justice to those families. And I saw firsthand how the families of those 4 young girls who died and the 5th young lady who was so badly injured, how they suffered, how they were in many ways trapped in the past, unable to find peace, forgiveness, healing, or reconciliation, unable to find truth or justice as long as that crime remained unsolved. And I learned of so many other cases, so many across the country, particularly in the South, hundreds, if not thousands, of system where the system of justice just let these victims down. Cases where the truth had been buried, cases where justice had been denied. But I also saw how the cold cases can be solved and reconciliation can be found. Sometimes it just takes fresh eyes, another look by new investigators, law enforcement, journalists, teachers, students, members of the public. Those can be successful as well, even without a conviction. A successful prosecution is not always possible in cases this old, but knowing the truth can bring a tremendous sense of relief and release, and can open the door to healing and peace. This is the hope behind the creation of the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Collection Act. Making these records available can help heal families and communities that have been struggling with the suspicion, guilt, fear, and loss for too long. The act creates a review board that specifies that the nominees for the board must be distinguished individuals of high national professional reputation in their respective fields, who are capable of exercising the independent and objective judgment necessary to fill their role, who possess the appreciation of the value of each material to the public, scholars, and government. I can't imagine a better slate of nominees than those before you, 2 of whom I've known for a long time, 3 of whom have roots in Alabama, but all 4 are uniquely and perfectly suited for the work of this review board. I met Professor Margaret Burnham over 15 years ago when she founded the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project and began to examine cold case civil rights cases as part of her teaching at Northeast University School of Law. Born in Birmingham, Alabama, Margaret graduated from Tougaloo College in Mississippi and received her law degree at the University of Pennsylvania. After law school, she spent 3 years working with the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. She then moved to private practice until 1977, when she became the first African-American female to serve in the Massachusetts judiciary, appointed to the Boston Municipal Bench by then Governor Michael Dukakis. She's won numerous awards that are too numerous to mention throughout her career, but I will mention one in particular. In 1993, she had the honor of being appointed by South African President Nelson Mandela to serve on an International Human Rights Commission to investigate alleged human rights violations within the African National Congress. Margaret joined Northeastern University School of Law faculty in 2002 and continues to teach there today. Gabrielle Dudley grew up in Bessemer, Alabama, just a few miles west of my hometown of Fairfield. She is an instruction archivist at the Stuart A. Rose Manuscript Archives and Rare Book Library at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. After obtaining her BA in history from the University of Montevallo, also in Alabama, she earned her MA in public history and an MLIS with a concentration in archival studies and preservation management from the University of South Carolina. Gabrielle is a founding member of the Atlanta Black Archivists Alliance and holds memberships in the Society of American Archivists and the Grolier Club. Gabrielle has published articles and curated exhibitions related to her interest in Black women writers, literary clubs, and print and literature cultures of Black Southerners in the 19th and 20th century. My old friend and dear friend, Hank Klibenov, hails from Florence, Alabama, in the northern part of our state. First met Hank many years ago when he was a reporter, a journalist with the Philadelphia Inquirer. Currently, Hank is the professor of practice at Emory's creative writing program. He co-authored the book, The Race Beat, The Press, The Civil Rights Struggle, and the Awakening of a Nation, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2007. Prior to joining Emory, Hank was a reporter and editor for more than 35 years, having worked as a reporter at various newspapers in Alabama, Mississippi, and Massachusetts, at the Boston Globe, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He holds an undergraduate degree in English from Washington University in St. Louis and a master's degree from Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University. Hank also directs the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Case Project at Emory University, guiding students as they examine Georgia's modern civil rights history through the investigation of unsolved and unpunished racially motivated murders. His podcast, Buried Truths, won Peabody and Robert F. Kennedy Awards in 2019. And last but by no means least is Professor Brenda Stevenson. Brenda Elaine Stevenson is the inaugural Hillary Rodham Clinton Chair in Women's History at St. John's College at Oxford University, as well as the Nickel Family Endowed Chair in the Department of History, and a professor of African American Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Brenda's a social historian whose work centers on gender, race, family, and social conflict in America and the Atlantic world from the colonial period through the late 20th century. She was born and raised in Portsmouth, Virginia, and received her undergraduate degree from the University of Virginia, where she was a DuPont Regional Scholar and an Eccles Scholar. She enrolled at Yale's MA program in African American Studies and began her edition of the Journals of Charlotte Fortin Grimke while at Yale. And this work became part of the Schomburg Library of 19th century Black women's writers. She continued in the Yale PhD program in American history, and her PhD dissertation, Life in Black and White, Family and Community in the Slave South, was awarded a Gustav Myers Book Prize as an outstanding book in the study of human rights in North America. Another Professor Stevenson's books, The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins, Justice, Gender, and the Origins of the LA Riots, was awarded the Organization of American Historians 2014 James A. Raleigh Prize for the best book on the history of race relations in the United States, and the 2015 Ida B. Wells Award for Bravery in Journalism from Women's E-News. Mr. Chairman, as you can see from their resumes, and as you will hear from the nominees themselves, not only do they have the training and experience to perform the work of this board, they have a deep appreciation and passion for the significance of the work that they're about to embark on and the collection of these incredibly important papers. So, Mr. Chairman, as I close, I want to thank you again for allowing me to be here today and for your support of this legislation. I also want to go back briefly to a comment I made earlier, that in today's world, I really think bears repeating, that knowing the truth can bring a tremendous sense of relief and release and can open the door to healing and peace. Candidly, Mr. Chairman and members of this committee, former colleagues, truth is a somewhat scarce commodity these days, and especially right now in our history, in this time, in this place, we need to be doing all that we can to seek that truth, because knowing the truth can bring that tremendous sense of relief and release and open the door to healing and peace and justice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's been an honor to be with you today.
Well, thank you, Senator Jones. It is great to see you here again. And again, thank you for your incredible leadership with this legislation and this program. And clearly, by your introductions, we have 4 outstanding nominees here before us. We're looking forward to hearing their testimony and answering our questions. Ranking Member Portman, you are recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I hope you can hear me okay.
We can.
I've gone from a laptop to an iPad to an iPhone trying to come onto this hearing. And so I was listening, but not able to see you all until I went down to the iPhone level. I appreciate Senator Jones's introduction of our nominees today, and I appreciate what he and Senator Cruz and others did to get this legislation moving, and then President Trump for signing it back in 2019. That was a while ago. And it's about time that we move forward, not just with the nominations, but of course with the important work that has to be done. And my sense is because a few years have elapsed, there may be an effort to extend, which I think makes sense. I have had the opportunity, Mr. Chairman, to interview all 4 of these nominees. We talked a lot about their experience. We talked about their objectivity. There was discussion earlier about the commitment to the truth. That's what these individuals have told me that they are committed to. This is a very difficult period of our nation's history that they will be unveiling and disclosing, and it's really important that it be done. But these are stories of real people and real families who are still looking for answers, and one hopes that by providing this information, some of those answers will be found, and in fact, there'll be some sense of relief. Joining us today are journalists, scholars, lawyers, judges. This board, I think, is going to be populated with people who have the right experience. We talked a lot in our conversation about the need to balance public disclosure and privacy interests as these records are reviewed. That's no easy task. We also talked about the awesome power of a subpoena and how we have to ensure that the subpoenas are not abused, and also that the Attorney General has the ability to be petitioned by this board for the release of sealed records, another power that needs to be exercised carefully. So I thank the nominees for the willingness to serve on the board. I look forward to further discussion of these issues and, again, how they plan to use their experience and their wisdom to achieve the important mission of this board. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Portman. Now it's the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses. So if each of you will please stand and raise your right hand. Ms. Stevenson, we can't see you, but if you can acknowledge you hear us and you are standing and raising your right hand, I'd appreciate it.
I acknowledge that I hear you, and I'm standing and raising my right hand.
Do all of you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
I do.
Thank you. I've heard affirmative answers from all 4 of you. You may be seated. Well, welcome, Professor Burnham, Ms. Dudley, Professor Klibenov, and Professor Stevenson. We appreciate your appearance here today, and I want to congratulate you once again for your nomination to this important board. Professor Burnham, you may proceed with your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters and Ranking Member Portman. Thank you as well to Senator Jones and Senator Cruz and Senators McCaskill and Harris, who were the sponsors of this legislation, as well as Bobby Rush. And a special thanks to a teacher, Stu Wexler, and his students who brought this finally around to President Trump's desk. I also thank President Biden for this nomination and the members of this committee for the opportunity to appear here today. It is a deep honor and indeed the highlight of a very long career in civil rights to be nominated and to be considered by this august body. As you may know, the board will review government records to facilitate the expeditious disclosure of documents related to civil rights cold cases. The board will consider and render decisions on determinations by a government office not to disclose or to delay disclosure of civil rights cold case records. The board, as set forth in the statute, will decide whether a record constitutes a civil rights cold case record and whether the record or particular information qualifies for non-disclosure. All members of this board will meet to discuss how to carry out this mission. The members of the board will review redacted records or records for which public disclosure is postponed or requests for proposed postponement are made, and participate in rendering a report to congressional leadership. The board will request or can request, has the power to request, that the Department of Justice pursue a petition to release information relevant to civil rights cold cases that are held under seal by any court in the United States or abroad. If I am appointed, my priorities on this board would be to work closely with our national archives to assess which records and documents are subject to release under the law, to establish a schedule for the review of such records, and to engage and inform the public about the activities of the board, and to develop protocols for the release of qualifying documents as appropriate. If I am appointed with my fellow board members and the staff, I would work with Congress and representatives of this committee to implement recommendations to improve the review board's operations and effectiveness and properly carry forward with the intent of this legislation. I'm eager to serve as a member of this board because I believe it can play an important role in facilitating public access to government records that are related to civil rights cold cases, and thereby further the intent of Congress as reflected in the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crimes Act, as well as in this legislation, the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Collection Act, to serve the public interest in prompt disclosure of civil rights cold case records for historical, governmental purposes, and also fully to inform the American public about the history surrounding these cases. The disclosure of these records will serve to respond to concerns and questions of the families and the communities affected by these events. I believe that I, if appointed, would bring unique expertise and experience to this position. I'm familiar with the government records that are the subject of this act, having worked with these records as a scholar for more than a decade. I'm familiar with the community of researchers and scholars and civil rights activists and the descendant communities that seek prompt and comprehensive release of these documents. I have been a member of the bar for 50 years, and I have served as a Massachusetts State Court judge, as a practicing civil rights and criminal law attorney, and since 2001 as a law teacher. I'm very grateful for this nomination and the important public service opportunity that it presents, and I ask for your support. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Well, thank you, Professor. Thank you for your opening comments. Ms. Dudley, you may proceed with your opening remarks.
Good morning, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you as you consider my nomination to serve as a member of the Civil Rights Cold Cases Records Review Board. I am deeply honored by President Biden's nomination and am humbled that the work of this board could mean justice for so many families and move our country towards healing from the atrocities of the civil rights era. The aims of this board align with my professional ethos and yet are also deeply personal. I was raised by Maple and George Dudley in Bessemer, Alabama, which is a small suburb of Birmingham. As an Alabamian and Black daughter of the South, I grew up with the constant reminders of the struggles of the civil rights era and knowledge that unsolved cases existed. My upbringing and love for my country's history, albeit sometimes painful, led me to pursue a career as an archivist. I feel a special connection and obligation towards the work of the board, and if confirmed, will work with the other nominees to appropriately ensure public disclosure of civil rights cold case records. I am trained as an archivist and have been working directly with civil rights era collections for over a decade. In my work, I have arranged and described records, handled private and confidential materials, provided reference assistance to a variety of researcher groups, and used primary source material to engage audiences in classrooms, exhibitions, and public spaces. I understand the balance of providing access to critical records while protecting the privacy of witnesses and other parties which might be revealed within them. I embody and employ the principles of the Code of Ethics for Archivists and strive to exercise ethical and professional judgments in all my work. I recognize the cultural value of these records and realize how full access to them can spur both transformation and change. If confirmed, I am committed to immediately working with my fellow nominees and government entities to develop a schedule for reviewing the records and determining which can be publicly disclosed now and which require postponement. I consider my role as an educator to be as equally as important to the work of the review board as my role as an archivist. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the teacher and students from Heightstown High School who originated the bill that would later become the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Collection Act. I am encouraged by the potential for young people, scholars, journalists, artists, and others to access records that could potentially lead to further scholarship and understanding of the civil rights era, and potentially to even solving some of the cases. In my professional work, I coach college faculty, K-12 teachers, and other instructors on using primary sources like cold case records in their teaching, and advocate for students to use primary sources to better understand our country in the present day. I am cognizant of the impact that decisions of this board could have on young scholars learning about key movements within our country's history. The work of this board is timely and will have a tremendous cultural and social impact on the ways that the civil rights era is taught and discussed for generations to come. I am deeply honored to speak to you today and thank the committee for considering my nomination. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Dudley. Professor Klibenov, you may proceed with your opening remarks. Sorry, we can't hear you. If you check your mute.
Oh, I think they just unmuted me. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay. Chairman Peters, thank you so much. Ranking Member Portman also, and members of the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. My name is Hank Klibenov, and I do direct the Georgia Civil Rights Cold Cases Project at Emory University, where I'm a professor of practice. I also teach nonfiction writing and ethics in the creative writing program. I'm in my 11th year at Emory, teaching after 36 years as a newspaper reporter and editor in Mississippi, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago in the Midwest, and Atlanta. I was born and raised in Alabama, attended public schools there through high school, and then went to college and graduate school in the Midwest. In my family, which came to America from Eastern and Central Europe on both my paternal and maternal sides between 1905 and 1910, personal and professional recognition doesn't get any bigger than this, a presidential nomination. And now, this opportunity to have that nomination vetted, and I hope validated by this committee and by the entire United States Senate. Amazing. You have my deepest appreciation. I'm sorry that my parents and grandparents are not allowed to be part of this, For my dad, who took over his father's family shoe store on one side of the main street, Court Street in Florence, Alabama, and a ladies' clothing and shoe store on the other side, a day worth remembering was when Senator John Sparkman and later Senator Howell Heflin would casually walk in, say, "Hiya, Morris," and chat with my dad as a friend for 15 or 20 minutes. The conversations, no doubt, were about families, the economy, the Small Business Administration, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which was our Muscle Shoals region's lifeblood, or the draft, because my father was chairman of the local Selective Service Board. If we 5 children weren't lucky enough to be inside the store working and meet those august gentlemen ourselves, we'd hear about it over dinner. So you have my deepest respect individually as United States Senators, members of this committee, and of the whole chamber. I was in the Senate gallery the day Senator Jones introduced the bill that created the Records Review Board. Senator Ted Cruz was presiding and listening as Senator Jones spoke. And if I have my history right, as Senator Jones was leaving the well, Senator Cruz stopped him to say he wanted to join as lead Republican sponsor. Well, that was the turning point that propelled this bipartisan legislation to create this nonpartisan board. I hope it is long remembered that these 2 lawmakers from opposite sides of the political spectrum joined forces to do the right and rational thing for the families of victims of racial injustice. The law you passed and President Trump signed will expand, accelerate, and ease access to government-held records about racially motivated killings in the South. At this stage, there are probably few living perpetrators of these killings from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So while we're not likely to see many opportunities for criminal sanctions, criminal judgments, we may well see more opportunities for the judgment of history as these records become available. And we may well see more opportunities for racial peacemaking among families of perpetrators and victims. I have seen with my own eyes and my own heart the extraordinary good that can come when families of those who were killed sit down with a couple of 100 pages of government records and unlock decades of mysteries and myths and misunderstandings. I hope to have an opportunity to share a couple of those extraordinary moments with you later. The law, I believe, is clear and simple about what we are to do. We are not scripting new policies or solving whatever crimes are disclosed in those records. We are here to review and free up the government-held records that may hold clues and to make them available to victims, to families of victims, among others, who may not even know that the records exist in a government file cabinet. We don't know how many people were lost to racially motivated killings in all those years of the modern civil rights struggle, but we know that each killing destroyed more than a life. The removal of a father or a mother or a grandparent often meant the erasure of all memory of a family's entire history. We have an opportunity to provide the records that can enable families to fill in some of those gaps and give them the wholeness of history that they've not had for decades. In closing, there are and will always be hidden complexities we don't anticipate. I believe our task is to navigate those situations sensibly, with open minds and sound judgment, and in doing so to fulfill the noble mission you have set forth for us. I humbly and respectfully ask for your support in approving my nomination and moving this mission forward. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. Next, we have Professor Stevenson. We know we can't see you due to technical difficulties, unfortunately, but I know we can hear you loud and clear, so you may proceed with your opening remarks.
Good morning. I am deeply honored and thankful that you, the members of the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, are allowing me to speak to you today regarding my nomination to serve on the Civil Rights Cold Case Records Review Board. I'm honored by and grateful to President Biden for this nomination. I am appreciative of the Organization of American Historians for submitting my name for consideration. As always, I want to acknowledge my family for their encouragement and support. I truly thank God, from whom all of my blessings come. As an historian and U.S. citizen, I realize the importance of both historical documentation and transparency, particularly as related to difficult aspects of our society's functioning across time. I grew up in Virginia, a state that has stood at the center of democracy and of racial conflict, located in a region that, unfortunately, has a legacy as being a site of inequality. My parents were hardworking, God-guided Americans. My father, a longshoreman, and my mother, a homemaker, labored tirelessly so that I and my siblings could be well educated, get great jobs, and live fulfilled lives. They believed in the great promises of the United States as a democracy, as well as our responsibilities to our nation, and they implanted those ideals in me. But one of their tragic truths, based on their communal experiences, was that Black and marginalized people could be harmed, denied their constitutional rights without legal recourse. No citizen should bear the burden of the fear of inequality. I believe that our nation as a whole has a deep and abiding interest in issues related to civil rights, social justice, and equality within the context of our justice system. The mission of the Civil Rights Cold Case Review Board is to assist in the implementation of Civil Rights Cold Case Records Collection Act. If I am confirmed, I will work tirelessly to make certain that this work is comprehensively and competently completed in the time frames established in the law. The National Archives is tasked with collecting, preserving, securing, digitizing, and indexing civil rights cold cases in preparation for public viewing and use. The review board will aid preparation for public use in several ways. The board will determine if a record constitutes that of a civil rights cold case. If requested by an originating agency, it will determine if a civil rights cold case record or information, partial or complete, in that record qualifies under the law for postponement for public disclosure. The board will resolve how to separate that which can be made public from that which cannot, including the provision of a summary or substitute record. It is the board's responsibility to publish its decisions about record disclosure within 2 weeks of board decisions. These published decisions go on to the cold case's originating body, the Federal Register, the President, and to Congress. Annually, the board must report its activity to the Speaker of the House Minority Leader, the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform of the House of Representatives, the Majority Leader of the Senate Minority Leader, this body, the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, the President, the Archivist, and the head of any government office whose records have been the subject of review board activity. With all of these entities, the board also must cooperate. These are heavy responsibilities that will take time, energy, intellect, experience, and heartfelt commitment, cooperation between board members and their staff, as well as with NARA, the Congress, the Judiciary, and the White House. These responsibilities, along with the promise to the American people that the history of the 2018 Civil Rights Cold Case Records Collection Act embodies, is the work at hand. I believe that, if confirmed, I will be instrumental in fulfilling these duties. My educational background, proven expertise in U.S. history, the history of race and racial conflict, my successes as author, teacher, mentor, administrator, and public-facing intellectual, along with my deep personal interest in social justice, have prepared me to be especially capable of and committed to this work. Again, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you about this important work. I am deeply honored. I look forward to your queries and comments.
Well, thank you, Ms. Stevenson, for your comments. And again, thank you for all of you for being here today, and congratulations on your nominations. There are 3 questions that the committee asks for every nominee, and I would ask that each of you respond with just a yes or no. We'll go in the order that you presented your testimony, with Professor Burnham first, and Ms. Dudley, Professor Klibenov, and then Professor Stevenson. First, is there anything you are aware of in your background that might present a conflict of interest with the duties of the office to which you have been nominated?
This is Professor Burnham. No.
No, Senator.
But I think your Mute is on again, Professor Klibenov.
Okay, sorry, it's off again. No, sir. No, Senator. No conflict.
And this is Professor Stevenson. No, there is not.
Second, do you know of anything personal or otherwise that would in any way prevent you from fully and honorably discharging the responsibilities of the office to which you have been nominated?
Again, Professor Burnham, no, Senator.
No, Senator.
No, Senator.
Brenda Stevenson, no, Senator.
And lastly, do you agree without reservation to comply with any request or summons to appear and testify before any duly constituted committee of Congress if you are confirmed?
I do.
Yes, I do.
Yes, Senator, I do.
Yes, Senator, I do.
Great. Well, wonderful. This is a question for all four of you, and for this question, let's go in the same order that we went in at the beginning. I'll mix it up for another question or two, but we'll do this order. If confirmed, each and every one of you, as you well know, will be the first members of this review board, and you're going to have a heavy responsibility to stand it up. What you do in these initial days and weeks and months will set the course of this board for the future. So I would like each of you to describe your initial priorities for getting the board set up and running, and briefly discuss how you plan to approach those goals that form the basis of your priorities.
Thank you, Senator. I think our first priority would be to meet with the staff at NARA to determine which government agencies have in fact turned over records for inclusion in the collection, and to determine what, if any, processes NARA has already undertaken with respect to such records. It would also be a priority to staff the board, to hire a chief of staff and such other staff as would be necessary to facilitate our early and aggressive engagement in the work ahead if we are appointed. In addition to staffing and associating ourselves with the NARA staff who are responsible for the work to be carried out under the statute, we would also want to set a schedule for the release of records, again in consultation with the archives team, to set a schedule for the release of such records, and then to set a schedule for ourselves as to how often we intend to meet, under what circumstances we intend to meet, and how quickly we can get to the work of collecting, building the collection, and responding to the requests of agencies, if there are any, to postpone disclosure of the records. Thank you, Senator.
Great. Well, thank you. Ms. Dudley.
Thank you, Senator, for the question. I underscore what Professor Burnham has already said. I think one of the initial things that we really need to do is, if confirmed, is to organize ourselves as a board. And one of those first things that we should do, I think, is to select a chairperson for the board, and then also think about the staff that needs to be hired to support the work of the board. And then, of course, working with NARA to think about what agencies have already sent over records that can be reviewed, and then which agencies will still need to send records. And once we have sort of that initial organization done, how can we set a schedule for review of those records, but then, as Professor Burnham has said, a schedule for ourselves. And I'm, if confirmed, would be very willing to immediately jump into doing that work. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Professor Klibenov.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And for the question, first of all, let me just associate myself with the brilliant remarks of my potential colleagues, if we're all confirmed, Professor Burnham and Gabrielle Dudley, who I've had the pleasure to teach with here at Emory. I want to say, in addition to what they've said, is that Most of us are familiar with the National Archives. We're familiar with their record keeping. We're familiar with, through the Freedom of Information Act that we've used over the years, we know plenty of records have been already requested over the years by scholars, journalists, historians, families. And to use a line that I heard Ms. Dudley mention the other day, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that we can go ahead and bring in and start to examine, even while NARA is trying to get other agencies that might be a little bit slower in turning their records over to do so. So there's we need to get some sense of the scope of the work. The clock is ticking, and we know that the time is limited that we have under the law unless we're able to, get an extension. So I do think we need to get a sense of how much there is out there, the magnitude of the work. I will say lastly that I think we all appreciate this is not an honorary board. This is a working board. And there's a lot to do, and we are all committed to doing it for the same reason we've been committed to this work in all the years leading up to this. So thank you.
Yeah, very good, Professor. Thank you. Professor Stevenson, your comments.
Thank you, Senator, very much for this question, and thank you to my fellow nominees for all that you have said. It's nice to come last sometimes, and to build on that. If I am confirmed, I will work very quickly with the other members who are confirmed to, first of all, to choose a chairperson, to meet with NARA to go over what the landscape of this work will look like with regard to the numbers of cases and what has to be collected and how that will be collected. We'll have about 45 days, I believe, to choose a chief of staff and to begin staffing the committee as well. Which I will be, working to help to do, as well as we have about 90 days to set up a schedule for review, how we will review the cases. So all of this work has to take place right away. And then we have to, as a board, organize ourselves with regard to setting up advisory committees, as well as making decisions about how decisions will be made. And perhaps even setting up a website so that we can have public interface as well. And so all of those things have to be done immediately. I am very committed, if confirmed, to jumping right into this work and doing this very, very important duty for the nation.
Thank you, Professor. Well, it's clear that all of you have thought about this, and you realize that you have a big job ahead of you. And are all, I certainly appreciate you all speak enthusiastically about the job and are excited about tackling it. So thank you for that. Ranking Member Portman, you are recognized for your questions.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would first like to comment on the working board rather than an honorary board. This is a working board. Clearly, you all are viewing it this way. We talked about this in our earlier discussions. And one thing I mentioned is that under the statute, you have 90 days to publish a schedule for review of all civil rights cold case records in the Federal Register. So that alone, even if you weren't shortchanged on time generally because it's taken so long to get the nominees up and to get you confirmed, once you do hit the ground, you got to hit the ground running. And so I will just stipulate that my sense from talking to all four of you is you understand the importance of that, and it is a working board for sure. The two issues that, again, we've already discussed some that I want to hear you talk about in this public hearing context is one, balancing this interest of public disclosure and privacy and protection of those named in the record, such as witnesses. And as part of that, how would you handle this responsibility of subpoena authority and the ability to petition the Attorney General? And then the second question I have is with regard to impartiality. Some of you have made political contributions. All of us have personal political views. My sense from talking to you all is that you acknowledge that this is not a political appointment in the sense that this is an apolitical board and that impartiality and objectivity is key. And I'd like you to talk a little more about that too. So I'm giving you a lot to do in the 5 minutes or so remaining here. And let's start in the reverse order. So Professor Stevenson, if you can address one or all of those issues, and then we'll go to Professor Klibenov, and then Ms. Dudley, and then Professor Burnham. Professor Stevenson.
Thank you, Senator Portman, for your question. I will begin with impartiality. As a trained historian, what I'm trained to do is to be impartial in terms of the use of documentation and providing information to my audience. Whether my audience is, it can be a reading audience, or it can be a student-based audience, or it could be a radio audience. I am here to, in my work, to be impartial. That's the most important thing a scholar can do. And so I'm very much committed to that and have been for my entire career. I am very much encouraged by the impartial way in which this law was established and was voted on and has been supported. And that really, I think, will guide us if we are confirmed in our work, that this really comes out of the goodwill of all the political forces in our nation, and that is it's an honor to work on something and to keep that tradition going. So I look forward to, if confirmed, I look forward to being, if possible, a beacon of impartiality and in the committee. And with regard to, I'm trying to recall the first part of your, the balancing. Thank you for that question as well. You know, the law is very specific about what can be disclosed and what cannot be disclosed, at what reasons why an agency may not want to disclose certain materials. And I do believe, if confirmed, and with the fellow nominees, that we will work diligently to understand what the law means and what it means to the people of the United States. And so I will commit myself to following very carefully the details of the law with regard to the information that is exposed and our attempts to get information that may be helpful to us in our decision making. I understand.
Thank you for those
Thank
answers. I'm going to go on to the next witness and say that you've answered the questions well, but there are a couple out there I want to be sure others have a chance to answer too. One, Mr. Klibenov, is as to the subpoena authority and to the power the board has to ask the Attorney General to petition a court to release sealed information.
Yes, of course, as you know, the law that the Senate and the House passed and that President Trump signed does give us some subpoena authority in certain situations. It is not something that I anticipate we will be using randomly. I don't anticipate we would be using it recklessly. I think that this is a very, very serious responsibility. And I think we know that. And we understand that there are reasons along the line historically that certain records have been held off limits, that certain records have been sealed. We need to find out what those reasons are before we move to try to countermand that. So I think you will find us to be very reasonable about that. And I think that you know that we will be discussing this with the Attorney General, with the National Archives. I think we probably need an advisory committee of lawyers who deal in the world of privacy and First Amendment issues in order to make sure that we're not stepping in something that's bigger than we want to get into. So
Great.
We take it seriously.
Thank you for that. And again, I want to make sure we get to other two members. Let me just briefly on the advisory committee, you do have the authority to do that under law. And that's one of the questions that I would have asked if I had a little more time, but that's an interesting use of the advisory committee would be to have lawyers who are trained and day-to-day deal with this balancing of the public disclosure versus privacy issue. Ms. Dudley, thoughts on any of these questions?
Thank you, Senator. So I will say, as I mentioned in my opening statement, that I really do embody and employ the Code of Ethics for Archivists, which I strive to exercise ethical and professional judgments in all of the work that I do. And I should say in my day-to-day work in Rose Library at Emory University, one of my charges is to balance access and privacy. I work in public services, so we are providing access to researchers, but also making sure to honor the agreements that we have with donors that have donated their materials and have certain stipulations. So I am very comfortable with doing that in my role, my professional role, and then also could bring that to this board if confirmed.
Thank you.
If I could just jump in, Ranking Member, I have to jump off to get an armed service question in. You may continue your questions, and then Senator Carper, you'll be recognized after the Ranking Member is done, and have the gavel till I return.
Will that happen today?
That's right now, yes.
All right, thank you.
Professor Burnham, any response to those questions? And we'll go on to allow Senator Carper to take over the panel.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Portman. On the subpoena power and the question of balancing interest in non-disclosure or concerns that might lead to non-disclosure and our interest in disclosure, I would say that the statute is really well drafted in that it lays out exactly what issues might give rise to non-disclosure. And so we would just really follow along the lines of the statute. And the statute, of course, echoes lots of law out there about reasons why government records ought not to be made generally available. Subpoena power, I agree with my colleagues that if appointed, we would all use our best judgment to obtain records without having to resort to subpoenas. But if it appeared that records were necessary to complete the collection, we would obviously have to consult quite closely with and be guided by the judgment of the Attorney General and whatever counsel are advising the board. On the question of impartiality, of course, I would be completely impartial on these issues. This is as Professor Klibenov has indicated, a completely impartial board, although nonpartisan and impartial board, although it reflects the views across the parties in the country. So I would, of course, be impartial here.
Well, thank you, Professor Burnham. I appreciate those answers in our private conversations and also what you all put on the record publicly. And I wish you all well with the important mission and look forward to checking in, assuming you are confirmed, with the progress of the board and the results of your work. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and back to you.
I'm not Mr. Chairman, but I used to be. And I appreciate the handoff. Senator Portman, thanks very much. I would just say to our witnesses, before I ask a couple of questions, I just want to acknowledge the high school students who are responsible for this legislation, which created the review board. I don't know what when Senator Portman was a high school student and what he was focused on, and when I certainly wasn't anything nearly as important or as heady as this. So I take my hat off to the students. As my colleagues said, no, we talk a lot in the Senate about the word cloture with respect to moving from one item of business to another. We don't talk a lot about closure. And when I was a House member, both Senator Portman and I went served in the House, and he went on to do a lot of other things, and I've been fortunate as well. But I focused a lot on closure. In 1991, I was visited by a number of veterans groups as a congressman who came to talk to me about closure for families whose loved ones were never, whose remains were never recovered during the Vietnam War. They were MIAs, and years had gone by since they disappeared. In some cases, they'd been in airplanes, some cases on ground forces, but there were literally thousands of them. And I was privileged to lead a congressional delegation, bipartisan congressional delegation, I think it was 1991, at the urging of then President George Herbert Walker Bush and his administration, to find out what happened to as many of those thousands of MIAs as we could, and ultimately a very successful mission. And we worked in conjunction with a couple of our Senate colleagues, including John Kerry and John McCain, to not only find out what happened to the folks whose bodies were never recovered, who were listed as MIAs, but we also were able to move toward normalizing relations between the U.S. and Vietnam. Now they're one of our strongest trading partners in that part of the world, and we were able to provide closure to literally hundreds of American families, and as to what happened to their loved ones. So the word closure, I've thought a lot about that, and I understand from that earlier experience just how important it can be. A couple of questions, if I could. I would say to our witnesses, Judge Burnham and Mr. Klibenov, when it comes to finding solutions for tough problems, oftentimes, say my colleagues have heard me say, find out what works, do more of that. Find out what works, do more of that. And I would just ask Judge Burnham, I understand you founded the Northeastern University's Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project. And Mr. Klibenov, I understand you have experience starting a civil rights cold case project at Emory that examines unsolved or unpunished racial motivated murders in Georgia. Given that the board is newly established, what are some best practices that both of you intend to bring to the board to help guide and facilitate its work if confirmed? Judge Burnham, why don't you go first, and then Mr. Klibenov. Klibenov, excuse me.
Thank you very much, Senator Carper. First of all, what we do at the Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project is we take each case, one case at a time, and we look for the family members or anyone else who might have been affected by these events, and we seek them out and obtain their stories and find out from them what they remember about the event, how the event affected them, how it affected their family legacies and their family histories. And we combine that with the documents and research that that our students are able to unearth mostly from government documents, from DOJ documents, FBI documents. So I would say that our job is really to make this available. If appointed, the job of this board would be to make this material available to the American public. And then they will have at it. The family members, the communities, the historians, they will all have at this material and make sense of it for themselves. For each community, that may be a very different thing. In some of our situations, we've had exhibitions at museums. We had an exhibition at the Mobile Museum where we brought together the family members of those who had suffered losses as a consequence of Jim Crow violence in the 1940s. So the processes by which this material will be absorbed into American history generally, but as more specifically into the family history, the history of each family and community, will differ across the country. But the most important thing at this point for our country, I do believe, Senator Carper, is disclosure, is making the information available, much as you did with respect to MIAs in Vietnam. Find out what we know. Find out what we know and make that information available. Open it up. Give it some fresh air.
Good. Thank you, Judge. I have about another minute. I'm going to ask Mr. Klibenov to respond briefly to the same question, but what are some best practices that you intend to bring to the board to help guide and facilitate its work?
Sure. The work that we do in our teaching is very different from the work we're going to be doing on this, because we are not researching cases here. This is not us re-examining, reviewing, adjudicating guilt or innocence, any of that sort of thing. However, what we teach are research methods. we teach about the everyday, and Ms. Dudley knows this better than anybody as an archivist. Every day, more and more archives are being unearthed and are becoming digitized and are being available. So we arm our students with knowledge on how to access those records. And as Professor Burnham said, we go to the scene. We do a lot of field work to and it was through that, by the way, I'll tell you very quickly, it's because we had access to the records of a man named Isaiah Nixon, killed in 1948 for voting in Georgia, that we were able to find out why we had been able to get his death certificate. It's because he died 2 counties away from where the man shot him. The 2 men shot him because he voted. That's why they shot him. And he had to be rushed 2 counties away because it's the only hospital that would take a Black patient, okay? And that's where we found his death certificate, which led to my students finding his grave site 67 years after the family lost track of it, okay, down in a clearing in the woods in Georgia, in southeast Georgia. And it allowed his daughter, Dorothy, who may be watching it today, and I hope she is, to be reunited with her father at his gravesite that the family hadn't been able to find for 67 years, which in turn led the nephew of the 2 men who killed Isaiah Nixon to come forward and to say, I want to apologize to the Nixon family for what my uncles did back in 1948. So best practices is, as Professor Burnham said, disclosure, unearthing the records that can allow all of these sorts of wonderful things to happen.
Thank you very, very much for that. I'm not going to have time to ask on the record here today questions that I have for Ms. Dudley. I'm going to mention the questions and we'll ask you to respond for the record, if you will. But Ms. Dudley, a question for you, given your expertise as an archivist with a focus on the culture of Black Southerners in the 19th and 20th centuries, how will you approach this important mission of the board to provide transparency that will bring closure, hopefully, for victims, families, and communities, and help the American public better understand this part of our nation's history? And as a question for the record that I'd ask Dr. Stevenson to respond to would be, how will you draw on your experiences as an educator, as a scholar, and as an administrator to carry out the board's heavy responsibilities, as you mentioned in your opening statement? Those will be my questions. I'll ask you to respond to them for the record, if you will. And I would say for the record, my sister and I, born in a coal mining town in West Virginia, Beckley, we grew up in Danville, Virginia. Danville, Virginia was the last capital of the Confederacy. And so these are issues that are close to our hearts as well. Grateful to these high school students for the work that they've done in raising this flag and following through, and also grateful to those who've been nominated and are witnesses before us today. Thank you all. God bless you.
Thank
and
you.
I think next in line to ask questions is one of our oldest members, actually one of our newest fathers from Georgia, Senator Ossoff, and he's been smiling for a couple of weeks now since the birth of his first child. We're very happy for him. I yield to Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for those kind words. And thank you to our panel for your willingness to serve in this vital mission. It is so important that we continue to pursue these cold cases. It's so important that we help bring closure to families and communities, that we continue to unearth documents, that we support these efforts to pursue justice decades later. Of course, this is vitally important in my state of Georgia, and Mr. Klibenov, of course, you and I have met and spoken in the past. I'm grateful for your work at Emory University with the whole Emory community, for the support that you provided families across the state to help them seek justice and closure and truth. And I look forward to supporting your nomination for this position. In Georgia, as you know, Mr. Klibenov, and to the rest of the panel, there remain cold cases, open cases, unsolved murders, justice yet secured. Victims like Alfonso Harris, who was a member of the SCLC, murdered in Albany, Georgia in 1966. Caleb Hill Jr., who was pulled from a Wilkinson County jail in Georgia, middle Georgia, in the middle of the night in 1949 and brutally shot to death by a lynch mob. Ernest Hunter, who was killed in a Camden County jail in St. Mary's in 1958. I want to urge this committee and the whole U.S. Senate to expedite the consideration and approval of these nominations so that this board can instantaneously embark upon this vital work of supporting the efforts to secure justice and truth in cases like these in Georgia, others across the South, and across the country. Mr. Klibenov, given your deep experience working in Georgia, could you please talk about what you've been doing at Emory University with the Emory community working on cases like these, and talk about the importance for communities across our state of continuing to pursue the truth in these cold civil rights cases?
This is largely a student project. I mean, I teach students in my class, and we're doing the field work in the class, and we're doing the research in the class. COVID has complicated some of that, but we have gotten we get insights from community members when we go down there, and we meet with people who can take us to places we otherwise wouldn't know, because the places where something happened have been bulldozed over. Or there's now a rug, a road where there used to be a nighttime place where people would go and someone would be killed. There's so much that the community can get involved in. I think that at Emory, we're fortunate that we have other departments that are interested in these cases and can go in and do some work with us, whether it's community service work or to help bring people along, and to frankly, it's for many people in communities, it's an education. They don't even know this happened in their own community. These were not stories that were covered in the local newspapers in many cases, not in the weekly newspapers. In the Black newspapers they were, but not in the main white newspapers. So there's a lot of education that we feel like is important to bring to these communities.
Thank you, Mr. Klibenov. And to the rest of the panel, I'd like to ask you briefly for your affirmative commitment to work with communities in the state of Georgia, to work with my office, to work with the families of victims still seeking truth and justice in Georgia, and to give every effort to pursue and unearth the facts and records pertaining to those cases, as you will and must for cases in all states, should you be confirmed to these positions.
This is Margaret Burnham. Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Yes, you have my commitment to work closely with your office. Hank Klibenov and I have worked together over 10 years, and much of that work has been focused on Georgia. You mentioned the Caleb Hill case. That was a case we took up about 10 years ago, and we have many, many documents and have met with individuals who are deeply familiar with that case. So yes, you do have my commitment, and I thank you for yours.
Thank you, ma'am.
This is Professor Stevenson.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Senator. I affirm that you have my commitment to work with your state and to work with your office with regard to these cold cases. As a social historian, I have committed myself throughout my career to working with materials that impact communities and families. And so often in very horrifying ways. And so I look forward to bringing my expertise and my commitment to this work. And with the many cold cases from your state, I am looking forward to and commit myself to working very diligently.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Senator. I am a resident of the state of Georgia, so I am very committed to working with your office, but also just very committed to, if confirmed, to the work of this board to do as you have mentioned for families and communities across our nation.
Thank you, Ms. Dudley, and it's an honor that we have two Georgians who have been nominated for these positions. I appreciate your commitment and the commitments of the rest of the nominees, and I'd like to just take a few remaining moments here to thank Chairman Peters for being such an extraordinary champion for the effort to solve and pursue the truth in these cold cases, for expediting this hearing. Mr. Chairman, for your commitment to civil rights and to truth and justice in these civil rights cold cases. And I want to urge my colleagues on this committee and in the whole Senate, in the interest of pursuing truth and justice in Georgia and across the country, to move these highly qualified nominees to the floor as swiftly as possible and confirm them so they can continue the work they're already doing in their communities at the national level. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Senator Ossoff, and thank you for your leadership as well. Senator Johnson, you are recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to second the comments of a number of my colleagues, thanking the nominees for your willingness to serve. This is a working board. I think you're well aware of it. I was chairman when Senator Jones introduced this piece of legislation, and this was the committee's jurisdiction. I was happy to take up this bill, get it passed through the committee, and shepherd it through the Senate and to final passage and signature by the president. As the chairman of this Senate Oversight Committee, I mean, we are the primary committee that provides oversight, and that means disclosure. And so I have a huge bias toward transparency and disclosure. And I really do believe there's way too much information classified and kept secret and kept hidden. And so this really was a very easy piece of legislation for me to support. And I want to make sure that you're all very successful. And again, I'm very heartened by your comments and by your testimony here today in your bias toward disclosure and closure, for the purpose of closure. I think the other purpose of this is to hopefully help the racial healing in this country. We have too far to go, quite honestly, and I'd like to see greater healing. Now, there are restrictions, and they kind of fall under three main headings: not to disclose in case of national security, personal privacy, or ongoing law enforcement. As you're aware, these are cold cases, so I'm not sure the ongoing law enforcement provision will take effect too often, but it might. But again, I have got a bias toward disclosure, and it seems like all of you do too. So I support that bias. But I guess I'm just asking, in what cases and what criteria would you use for keeping things private, for not disclosing? And kind of like just go starting with Professor Burnham, because we've heard, obviously you've got criteria in the law. Ms. Dudley talks about her code of ethics to use best judgment. So I'm really kind of interested, what criteria are you going to use should you come across a situation where you're not going to disclose information? So we'll start with Professor Burnham.
So thank you very much for that question, Senator Johnson. As I said, I think the statute is really quite clear. And then obviously this is a case-by-case determination. For example, the statute allows non-disclosure in a case where revealing the identity might pose a substantial risk of harm to living confidential informants. Now, the cases that we will be looking at, or the material that we will be looking at, are cases that were taken up by the DOJ or the FBI or both from 1940 to 1979. So when you get way back in those 1940 cases, they're not likely to be any living confidential informants. If you get to some of the later cases, there may very well be informants whose lives could be endangered by disclosure. So if there's such a showing under the statute, then non-disclosure would have to be the right answer there. I certainly agree with you that the thrust of the statute and the intent of Congress is towards disclosure. That's the whole purpose, the rationale of the statute, is to collect these cases, collect these records, put them in one place, and disclose them. But the statute is really quite clear, and as I said before, it echoes other statutory provisions in our code that favor non-disclosure, where disclosure is going to affect particular interests. And so we'd have to be guided by, first of all, if there are any regs out there, if there are case law out there that might help us fill in the gaps in the statute. But the language, I think, is really quite clear and comprehensive.
Okay, so Ms. Dudley, do you kind of agree that this is going to be relatively cut and dry in terms of if you ever do come across a situation where you're not going to disclose? Or do you think there will be an awful lot of judgment calls here?
Thank you, Senator. I would agree. I do think that the statute does lay it out very clearly in places where we can't disclose, or postponement is sort of the recommendation there. But I will also say, to echo some of what Professor Burnham has said, that the statute is very clear. But I also think that each one of the nominees, if confirmed, brings something very different to this board, and I think we could rely on each other. I don't think we're going to be making any decisions in a vacuum, that we can all sort of come together to have discussions about anything if there is a case where that's something that might need further discussion. I think that we could all come together, if confirmed, to have those conversations, but then also, again, rely back to the statute and then to any advisory groups that we might be able to appoint for help with those recommendations.
Okay, well, Mr. Klibenov, do you anticipate any areas where you're going to have to use your judgment? And can you give me your criteria in terms of those judgment calls?
I think,
or do you also think it's pretty clear cut?
No, I think realistically there will be times. I think I said in my opening remarks, there will be times when there's some hidden complexities we didn't anticipate. I too have a predisposition toward disclosure, and maybe that's the old journalist in me. But it doesn't mean that I believe that everything ought to be out there, but I do have a predisposition on that. If we don't come at this with this idea that we do want to disclose more than has been disclosed previously, then you don't need us. You might as well just go back and rely on the Federal Freedom of Information Act and all the exemptions that were there. I think that expediting access to information, yet redacting it, becomes sort of an exercise in futility for those who were trying to get the information. So I do think we will have some judgments. I think most of them, we've seen the records before, and we have a sense of what's in there. And I don't think we're going to have knockdown, drag out arguments over these things. I will say that what's happened over time, this is an organic process. Things that were redacted in the 1970s and 1980s, removing the names of confidential informants who have since died. Our charge is to protect only living confidential informants. And so I think that's an opportunity to go back and review things. And I think we'll have to get into some of the details and some of the weeds of what were the extenuating circumstances.
So again, I'm sympathetic with not wanting to answer a hypothetical question, but I do want to kind of suss out just an example or examples of where there may be something sensitive that you might want to, maybe it won't be cut and dry, but what would be some of those sensitive areas where you might say, nah, don't want to disclose this? I just want to get some sense for that.
Well, it's easier for me to ask those where we've run into redactions.
Example.
Well, in 1958, a federal grand jury in Macon, Georgia, that was investigating police shootings of 2 or 3 killings of 2 or 3 people down in Dawson, Georgia, in Terrell County. And among the things that happened there was one of the key witnesses happened to be on the streets of Dawson in the days leading up to the grand jury. And the police officer who was under investigation by the grand jury saw him and jailed him for the entirety of the grand jury. And because we don't have access to those grand jury reports, we have no idea if anyone ever said, where's Mr. Gaucher? Where's the witness? Where is the person? We don't know how that was managed. So there are things that there's a lot of curiosity about the way things were done in the past. And in some of these communities, I think we know that it was there was a group think about these kinds of cases. And they all stood, whether it was the judge and the police chief and the sheriff and the prosecutor were all pretty much on the same side. And if they wanted something not to come out, they could make sure it didn't come out. I'm not sure these days we want those things to be kept from the public.
Okay, well, that's arguing for disclosure. Professor Stevenson, I realize it's kind of a difficult question I'm asking here, but do you have anything to add?
Well, thank you very much, Senator, for the question. And what I'd like to say is that I think my co-nominees have been very wonderful in terms of the ways in which they've looked at the law, because the law does give us very specific reasons for non-disclosure. But as a historian, as a social historian, I do know that history is not cut and dry. And oftentimes there are unintended consequences of disclosure or of non-disclosure. And I think we'll have to think very carefully about them. We'll be guided by the law. If approved, we'll be guided by the law, but we will have to draw on our sense of our knowledge, as well as our ethics, as well as the law. And we will have to consult with many different entities if we get into a situation where disclosure would mean exposure of people who may be harmed, people who are not necessarily the named person within the particular cold case, but have associations with these people, et cetera. And so knowing that, things can get sticky and they can get blurred is something that I think we will, if approved, we will face and that we will work collectively with as well as with advisors to try to make the best decision at the time.
Okay, well, thank you all again for your willingness to serve. And I guess my final comment is I was glad to shepherd this through our committee because I'm for disclosure and for transparency, but I'm also hoping for greater racial healing. And I really hope this piece of legislation, I hope your actions can contribute to that. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Senator Johnson. And thank you for your efforts in shepherding this through back in 2019. Thank you for that. It was a pleasure to work with you on that. And thank you for your questions here today. And again, to all of our nominees, congratulations on your nomination. It's clear that this is a working board and you are all ready to roll up your sleeves and get to work. You're chomping at the bit to get there, which is great. And we look forward to moving your nomination process forward as quickly as possible. All four nominees have made financial disclosures and provided the required responses to biographical and pre-hearing questions submitted by this committee. Without objection, this information will be made part of the hearing record, with the exception of the financial data